Imagine having a history so bad, so vile, so violent, that you have to make it illegal to learn it. American conservatives have gone by many names. They've been called Democrats, they've been called Republicans, they've been called the Lily Whites, they've been called Klansmen, redemptionists. They've gone by many names. But the consistent thing about American conservatism is that it has been about ensuring that capital fully controls labor, and that capital controls labor without being taxed to the greatest extent possible. So they want control of labor and they don't want to be taxed. I mean, that's what the American Revolution was about, right? Think about the fact that the time that this country has had perfect, pristine capitalism was during the slavery period. This country became an empire in less than 200 years, unprecedented in the world, based on the fact that you had pure capitalism. Labor costs were a minimum. You didn't have to spend extra money feeding the enslaved people. You just fed them the scraps, right? That's why the Caribbeans eat oxtail. They eat the ox, you get the tail, right? You just feed them the scraps, the chitlings. Think about all the food that African Americans eat that is considered, endemic African American food. It's based on the scraps. Chicken wings, neck bones. You're basically eating the main food and then throwing the things you don't want to the enslaved people. It's just that enslaved people were really super creative and made that shit tasty, right? But they were still eating the scraps of the food you had, so no extra cost there. You just throw them into a cabin, right, on the property you already own. No extra cost for that. The main costs were spillage, meaning people running away. And there was a lot of that, right? Rebellions, and that kind of thing was like very risky. Abortion, enslaved women taking herbs and things to abort the babies that you put into them by rape or through forced breeding, right? Which deprives you of property, valuable property. Thomas Jefferson is one of the people who, sort of revolutionized the idea of forced breeding, right? And so your costs were fairly minimal as long as you can minimize the number of people who run away. And you usually did that through extreme violence. But this was pure capitalism. And the big capitalists in this country have been trying to replace that system ever since. Remember, this capital, this human capital, is worth $4 billion at the time of the Civil War. And people became phenomenally rich with no income tax in what became the United States of America before the 20th century, when the income tax was passed, the federal income tax. And so you're talking about huge amounts of untaxed generational wealth. The big capitalists have been trying to replace that system ever since, whether it's with impoverished Irish labor or Italian labor, Chinese labor to build the railroads for pennies, pennies on the dollar, working for as cheap as possible, annexing places like Puerto Rico and using that labor to supplement the cheapest labor you can get, right? Grabbing and creating an empire, grabbing Hawaii, grabbing as many territories as you can, where you can then take that labor and make that your new cheap labor source. It's why we have an increasingly brown country, because it just kept grabbing different brown people to do the work for cheap. But that's like really fundamental to creating a lucrative capitalist empire. And the reason that conservatives are so freaked out by the idea of people learning real history, right? And why they want to replace real history with this actually absurd pretend history, like the PragerU stuff, where they basically say, it's better to be a slave than to be killed. Slavery was no big deal.
Slavery is as old as time and has taken place in every corner of the world, even amongst the people I just left. Being taken as a slave is better than being killed, no? Before you judge, you must ask yourself, what did the culture and society of the time treat as no big deal?
And trying to get, modern children to believe absolutely ridiculous stuff when they can actually learn more on TikTok, to get them to believe that Frederick Douglass was in favor of slowing down that whole emancipation thing.
Children, our founding fathers knew that slavery was evil and wrong. and they knew that it would do terrible harm to the nation. They wanted it to end, but their first priority was getting all 13 colonies to unite as one country. The southern colonies were dependent on slave labor, and they wouldn't have joined a union that had banned it.
Are you okay with that?
I'm certainly not okay with slavery, but the Founding Fathers made a compromise to achieve something great, the making of the United States. It was America that began the conversation to end it. But Leo is correct that big problems need to be approached very carefully.
Come on. And even trying to get them to, think poorly of white abolitionists.
Have you kids heard of William Lloyd Garrison?
No.
Nope.
He's an abolitionist like me, and he and I used to be friends, but we aren't any longer. We don't agree how to solve problems. William refuses all compromises, demands immediate change, and if he doesn't get what he wants, he likes to set things on fire.
Sounds familiar.
Sounds like you know the type.
Yeah, we've got that type in our time.
So, you're trying to work for change inside of the American system.
Precisely, Layla. Our system is wonderful, and the Constitution is a glorious liberty document. We just need to convince enough Americans to be true to it.
The reason they're doing that is what they're afraid of, right, is that they know, like I know, that the research says that when white children learn real history, including the bad parts, and let's be clear, there are a lot of bad, really violent parts of American history, they don't learn to hate themselves. The research shows they just become more empathetic. That when black kids learn real history and brown kids learn real history, they simply get higher self-esteem because they understand there's nothing inherently wrong with them and that the challenges that people who look like them face are down to systemic racism and oppression. It isn't something wrong with them. But the white kids, they don't hate themselves as a result of learning. They become more empathetic. But the risk of that is that they then will support policies that reduce the power of capital and increase the power of labor. They'll start to side with the picketers and not the industrialists or the big media companies, right? They'll side with the people in the desks and the cubicles and not the CEOs. They'll side with the poor and not the rich. They'll side with the workers and not the bosses. And that's risky because when they start to side with the workers and not the bosses, they might actually vote to tax capital. They might vote to regulate capital. And taxes and regulation are the things that the conservatives fear the most. And so when they go to these strategies of stoking division, interracial conflict, racism, ginning up whether it's white versus black racism and anti-blackness or non-white racism and pushing Asian versus black and pitting us against each other. All of this is strategic, y'all, because what they are afraid of is that their kids will combine with and side with and unite with black and brown and Asian American kids across a generation and regulate capital and tax capital, and that the policies that they will support in the future when they're in control will make labor more powerful versus capital. It's all about the Benjamins. It's all about money, and it's all about keeping labor down and capital way on top. See what you're seeing? Understand what they're doing in their strategies, whether it's voter suppression, trying to control women's reproduction, to drive more and more women out of the workforce, and create less labor competition for men, right? Trying to deprive black people of access to higher education. Think about all the things they're doing. All of these strategies are about making capital, particularly white male capitalists, more and more and more powerful the way they were in the original version of this country. Because for them, that was the good old days. See what you're seeing. Wake up. Stay united and stay woke.